Welcome to Common Sense Unfiltered, where we talk common sense. Because as it turns out, it's not all that common.
I'm Katie Ratliff, Executive Director of Common Sense Institute, Arizona.
I'm Kelly Caulfield, Executive Director of Common Sense Institute, Colorado.
And I'm Cinnamon Watson, National CEO of Common Sense Institute.
Across the country, policymakers are making big decisions on complex issues that are often filtered through politics and partisanship. That's where CSI comes in.
We're nonpartisan, nonprofit, and focused on the facts. And each episode, we bring in the experts behind the research to break down complex issues and what they actually mean for your business, household, and family.
This is Common Sense Unfiltered, where common sense still exists, even when it's hard to find. Hi, and welcome to Common Sense Unfiltered. I'm Cinnamon Watson, the CEO here at Common Sense Institute, and we are thrilled that you're joining our podcast today. Today, we are going to skip the spin and dive right into the facts of one of Colorado's most controversial issues, river access. And we're fortunate enough to have a panel of experts here to enlighten us on the facts, the data, and all of the angles of this important topic. Our two natural resources fellows here at CSI Colorado, Greg Walter and Mike King, have both served as the director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources and our research director here at Common Sense Institute Colorado, Cole Anderson. Together, they make a great team and have a wealth of information on this important topic. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you. Let's dive into it. Let me start with the simplest version of this question. In Colorado right now, can I get out of my kayak and wade through a stretch of the river on someone's private property? Mike?
Well, the short answer is no. You are not allowed to touch the bank or the bottom of a stream. You are allowed to float through it if you can do so without touching the bank or the bottom. We find ourselves in Colorado dealing with this issue. It seems like once every 10 or 15 years, it percolates under the surface and then pops up. But this has been the case in Colorado for 150 years, and we have multiple court decisions that led up to a 1979 Colorado Supreme Court case that has set out the standard. And people have relied on it in Colorado, and certain groups want to change that law and change that judicial interpretation. But as of right now, it's pretty clear. You're allowed to float, but you're not allowed to touch.
So, Cole, can you give us a little insight into just how big this problem is or how many miles of stream we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big issue because, I mean, regardless of the exact mileage we're talking about, the possible changes to the law that we've heard could be possible would alter the entire dynamic between public recreationists using waterways and private landowners in the state in a way that we haven't really seen before. To get at your question about just how many river and stream miles are we talking about here, there's really three numbers in our latest report that help contextualize this. The first is that total river miles and stream mileage in Colorado is estimated to be around 107 to 110,000 miles of streams, rivers, pretty much any waterway that you can think of would fall under that number. For the purposes of our report, we estimated that a little more than half, about 55 to 65,000 of those miles run through private land. So a little over half fall under private land, the rest would be in public. And the third number is our estimate of actually floatable river and stream miles that run through private land. In our report, we estimate there are roughly 1,400 to 1,700 miles that fit into that description. So while, it's a small fraction of the total miles in the state, less than 2%, these private river miles, floatable river miles, represent the vast majority of where issues may arise from possible legislative action on this issue.
Greg, is that what you are seeing on the ground as well?
It is. And as Cole said, the number is small if you try to limit it to just the miles that are reasonably thought of as floatable on private land. But that may not be the entire scope of the debate we're talking about, because if your right includes not just the right to float, but the right to wade, It's a key distinction in Colorado because the water belongs to the people of the state, but the land under it belongs to the adjacent landowner. Well, if you have the right to get out of your boat and wade, then you're talking about not just floatable miles, but all of the miles on private land. So you're back at the 55 to 65,000 miles of private land. So how you define that matters a great deal.
Let's talk dollars. Cole, what is the private stream access actually worth in Colorado?
Yeah, this is the $1 million or $1 billion question, really, around this issue. Looking into this when we were doing the research, there is no comprehensive data publicly available to answer it. But thankfully, with the help of Greg and Mike here, we were able to review some really terrific property appraisal data that gave us more insight. And we found that from 2007 to 2024, streamfront sales per mile ranged from about $500,000 per mile to $5.9 million per mile. So the average was just under $2 million per mile. And obviously that depends on river location and view and all these other intangible things like that. But looking back at that 1,400 to 1,700 mile range of floatable waterway, using that $2 million average, we're talking about a valuation in the range of $2.8 to $3.4 billion just for those private floatable miles, not even touching the far higher price tag if you go outside that range to include additional miles. But I think an interesting point here is if you talk to these property owners, and this is something that we explored a bit in our second report in this mini series with Greg and Mike, I'd confidently say a lot of them, and this is probably a big cliche, but they would say that it's priceless. I mean, many property owners on these stretches of land have spent hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars on their stretches of riverfront to improve the habitat, improve the landscape, a number of renovations that they pay for to make that happen. And they do that with the understanding that public recreationists can't disrupt that. And so not only would alterations to these access laws likely diminish those already in place investments, it would also discourage or likely discourage future investments in those areas, which typically benefit the waterway's health for many miles downstream.
Got it. And those numbers have been going up fast, correct? For instance, the Elk and Yampa River mileage in Routt County. Greg, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, the mileage specifically on the Elk and Yampa River, um, river miles are selling for $4 million a mile there now, and it's really important to know, and that's 50% more than it was just 5 years ago. But it's really important to note that the numbers that Cole just mentioned are not speculation. They're not economic modeling. Those are based on actual sales in Colorado, and it's not that difficult to look back at the sale of mountain properties that included a river or a stream. And so those are literally numbers that people have paid and are paying in Colorado, where if you want to buy a ranch that has the river flowing through it, that river is a couple of $1 million a mile or more, depending, as Cole said, on where it is. So if people think that we could just take a bunch of private property and declare it to be public land, there is a price to that. And as it turns out, it's a very significant price.
Mike, the report looks at specific properties and what happens to their value when access changes. I know Terryall Creek jumped out at me just because that's one of my husband's favorite places to fly fish. Um, and it's all about him, right? But the case study really jumped out, and can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, it jumped out to me. We have a cabin about 7 miles from it, so I'll bump into your husband now that it's public access. The thing that was interesting about Terryall Creek and its acquisition is it gave us the opportunity to look at not going from no access to unlimited public access, but there was an intermediate step where the landowner sold private access to a fishing club in the area. And so a limited number of people could go onto the property and take advantage of this really unique little river in Colorado. And what the research shows, what the price shows, is that even that allowance of a limited number of fishing club members reduced the price of the overall property by 65%. That 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 shows of all of the values that go into owning private property, the right to exclude is probably the one that drives costs the most, especially when you have an amenity like a river. The rest of the property, last year became available to the general public. And so we got a different transaction where Colorado Parks and Wildlife acquired the entire public access, and that resulted in a 75% diminution in value. So only an additional 10% going from a very small number of private fishing club members to the general public. The vast majority of the loss of value on that property resulted in anybody being able to go onto the property, even a small number.
75%. That's how much of the total, that's how much the property's total value disappears under full access. And keep in mind that that loss is almost entirely the river because the river was the most value to begin with. Greg, is that typical?
It is. In fact, we spend a significant amount of time with appraisers who make their livelihood valuing land of this kind and tracking sales all over the state. And the example on Terryall Creek that Mike mentioned is one of several where we've seen CPW and others purchasing access where they literally have to pay 85% of the value of the entire ranch to get access across the river. It can be, in fact, I think 75 is one of the lower numbers that I saw, and we looked at several dozen sales in the last 20 years all over Colorado, and it was fairly common for the value of the river to be 75 to 85% of the value of the entire ranch. That depends, of course, on acreage of the ranch, some other variables as well. But if you have a mountain property that you can build a cabin on, that's one thing. But if it's got a river flowing through it that you can fish exclusively, it adds millions of dollars a mile to the value of that ranch. And so taking away that access diminishes that value by a massive number. And it's not clear, I guess, how that would play out in some kind of a court proceeding on it. But you can't just take away that level of public value. You're talking billions of dollars statewide, as Cole mentioned, without having some kind of consequence to it.
So that's the part that really stirs up controversy here in Colorado, especially given our budget situation. If the law changes and landowners lose that access, there's a constitutional question about how or what they'd be compensated. Cole, I know you have looked a lot this year at not just this issue, but the budget in general. What sort of exposure does that actually look like for the state?
Yeah, this is a great question and sort of where the rubber meets the road on this issue, right? I mean, currently the state legislature is holed up working to finalize next year's budget, and they're staring down a $1.5 billion hole. So they're looking to pinch every penny, they're looking to save every dollar, and figuring out where savings can be had. And that extends, to all proposed legislative activity as well. Prospective bills that would generate a cost to the state simply aren't very feasible this year. So this is a key question. I really think there are two direct key costs that I'd like to mention here, one to the state and one to local governments that could be born out of this. The first, and the one we focused heavily on, and with gathered some expertise from Mike on this, is the possibility for litigation from property owners against the state under a takings clause. Essentially, they purchase private land. Alterations to the law could render it non-private, at least to a certain degree, as we've discussed, claim against the state to be compensated for this corresponding loss in property value. Now, we don't claim to know what the exact dollar amount could be should these cases be successful, but it could run certainly into the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars based on the valuation of this land. But having the state be put in a position where it would need to litigate these cases at all would entail a substantial cost, regardless of the outcome. Acquiring lawyers, determining navigability, all these things cost the state money. And the second cost that we could see come out of this is at the county level through decreased property tax revenue. So, given properties in affected areas would see a large decline in certain cases in the value of their property, those owners would expect to see a lower property tax bill as a result. And counties where these properties are prevalent and count on this revenue should expect to see a decline in property tax revenue. So, those local officials and assessors should be aware of this issue.
Great. And Mike, why hasn't this issue been resolved in the last 150 years of statehood? I know you have a background in being a former assistant attorney general. Can you explain that to us and walk us through it?
So legally, the issue has been resolved. That's pretty unequivocal. What happens is, periodically, individuals, groups, who are advocates of public access, which I am as well, decide, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could be like Montana or New Mexico? And each of those states have a much more liberal right of access. In Montana is up to the high water, and certainly in New Mexico you can wade and float through rivers and touch wherever you want. So when you dive into it and look at the different situations, what's very clear, and it's not unclear, it's very clear. Colorado's state Supreme Court has interpreted and adopted previous findings by previous rulings by the same court, in finding that it's very clear in the Colorado Constitution that a landowner owns the land under the surface and the bank of rivers. And what has led Montana and New Mexico both to different conclusions is their state Supreme Courts interpreting their state constitutions have reached diametrically opposed rulings. And so all of this is predicated very much in judicial precedent that has evolved naturally and organically over the century and a half of statehood in Colorado. And it's important to understand that in law there is the concept of stare decisis, which means people should be able to rely on previous decisions and make future decisions according to that understanding. It's not a hypothetical, it's not an academic discussion. Those landowners who we've been talking about, and frankly every other landowner with riparian uh, access in their property, has paid the price under the assumption that they own the bed and the bank. They have invested, the second report shows tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to improve those properties, all based on their clear and correct understanding that in Colorado they own the banks and the riverbed. And so that's where we find ourselves in Colorado. It just seems like once every 10 or 15 years, we have to remind people that it's not free if you want to go and make all riverbed and banks public access in Colorado.
Got it. So, Greg, how do you respond to people that say, well, Montana did it, New Mexico did it. Why can't we just bite the bullet and do it?
Well, the short answer is we're not Montana and we're not New Mexico. Colorado is different than every other state in America when it comes to water. We have a different water situation than any other state. The only state in America that has no rivers flowing in, they all flow out. And in Colorado, we're actually legally entitled to use way less than half of the water that naturally falls in Colorado because of interstate compacts and treaties and so on, where millions of people, something like 90 million people in 17 other states, have a legal claim on water in Colorado. So that has forced us to evolve a completely different system of water law than a lot of other Western states have. And it goes all the way back, as Mike said, 150 years. It goes clear back to the time of statehood. So I know there are people out there who say, well, this shouldn't have been private property to begin with. I hear that pretty often. And whether they think it should have been private property or not, it is. So that's the reality that we're dealing with. I know there's also organizations that will say, um, that'll say, well, this isn't really a taking because it should have been considered public land all along because those rivers were navigable at the time of statehood. But as Mike has also documented, the courts are very clear about the case law is long and drawn out on this and fairly consistent. In fact, there's only one entity that gets to say whether those rivers were navigable at the time of statehood, and that is the state. So somebody else can make that claim if they want to, but Colorado didn't. And the result of that was this constitutional understanding that go clear back to the beginning that Mike described. And so somebody can say it shouldn't have been private land. We should be like Montana. It's just, in my mind, that's pure fantasy because the reality is it is private land and we're not Montana.
Like that. So, Greg, right now we're sitting here in April with just under a month left in the legislative session. What's actually happening at the Capitol with this issue?
We're still looking at summaries and wish lists and statements of principles that people are printing and forwarding around the state on what they would like the law to be. What we're not looking at is actual legislation. So it puts people in a very difficult position to try and figure out how to debate legislation they haven't seen yet. It's actually, in my mind, sort of an affront to the democratic process for somebody to wait to the very end of the legislative session without any language ever having been written or forwarded or looked at or read, so that if there is a chance that somebody may introduce a late bill at the very end of the session, it'll be a bill that has not enjoyed the committee hearing process and the public input process and a chance for people to read and debate it. So I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't have any great crystal ball into what the legislature is doing, but I can say at the moment there isn't any bill. There's still all kinds of talk that there might be a bill, which I think is unfair.
Greg, Mike, this is a really big issue for Colorado. For those people that are listening that are just hearing about this issue, what's the one thing they really need to know about this issue, especially if they're property owners with a river or stream on their land?
Man, that's a tough one because it to a certain constituency, this is a very superficially appealing argument. We should be able to have more. Other states have more. Why can't we? This pops up at least 2 or 3 times during my professional career, and kind of what Greg alluded to. The legislature, you find some members who are full steam ahead, and then they start to realize this is not um, a, 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 a free pass. There is a cost to this. That is why the legislative session is designed to be deliberative, why there are multiple steps and multiple hearings and fiscal notes attached, because it takes the time to, when you get an issue like this, to really figure it out. And every other time the legislature has thought, hey, let's take this on, they get towards the end and realize this is a can of worms, and there are unintended consequences, and there are risks to the state of Colorado that aren't necessarily apparent for those who do a drive-by on policy issues. So if I were a landowner with a river, it would be really frustrating to never be able to put this issue to bed. And I'm not sure we're going to this time if they don't introduce a bill, if we can ever say we're past this, because it just comes back time and time again. So that's not a great answer. I'm sure they're not pleased to hear that. But I do think the key to keeping this at bay is to make sure that everybody talks about it, researches it, does the fiscal analysis, and they will, cooler heads will prevail, and this won't move forward today or any time in the foreseeable future, in my opinion.
Well, that's
Yeah.
absolutely right. The other key takeaway that maybe people should think about is the extent to which this is kind of a solution in search of a problem. This is the third in a series of 3 reports that we've done on this, and the first one documented that there are thousands of miles of rivers and streams in this state that are available to people to float. Keeping in mind that the federal government owns a third of Colorado, it owns half of western Colorado, where all the mountains are, and there are hundreds of miles of rivers and streams on the Yampa and White and Colorado and Gunnison and Animas and San Juan and Rio Grande and all the other rivers in this state, Arkansas, the South Platte. There are hundreds and hundreds of miles that are well open to the public, and in fact, it's a hugely important part of our floating and is a $36 billion industry in Colorado as part of the outdoor recreation complex. Colorado has the number one most floated river in America, a stretch of the Arkansas. So somehow, for someone to try and create the idea that we have a huge problem because you can't access the rivers and there's no place to float, it's just plain not true. So I think it's one of the great things about this state is the diversity of land ownership, and the fact that we have incredibly valuable private properties. We have world-class fisheries that private people built and that the public benefits from because it improves habitat downstream as well. And we have lots of public land that people can access and enjoy as well. So I don't think there's a big problem that is in demand of a solution like this that would justify the unintended consequences that Mike described. I couldn't presume to pretend how some court might rule on this in the future, but I can guarantee you, if the legislature tries to change the rules, that there will be litigation over it. And what the cost and outcome of that is a little bit unclear, I guess. But it is definitely opening a can of worms, and we don't know where the end of it is.
That's great, super helpful, and certainly puts the issue in perspective. I can't thank both of you enough for all the work that you've put in at CSI on this issue. These three studies have been just really enlightening to all of our supporters and the general public. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here today. Cole, thank you. And look forward to our next deep dive into natural resource issues.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.